Awesome. So we are meeting today to discuss, or just to review what Papercuts has been working on for settings over the last two milestones. So this foundation starts to jump into working more in depth on settings. I thought it would be really helpful to have some insight from Sascha and team on what they've worked on. And I think, Sascha, you mentioned that yesterday that you encountered a lot of things that actually, I think this was your idea. So you've encountered a lot of things that would be helpful for us. So
hopefully, yes. Let me share my screen quickly. Can you see my browser window? Perfect. All right. So I don't want to bore you with like all the consistency changes we did, but just focus on maybe the biggest changes we did in the last two milestones. So the first thing was the addition of sticky sections. So some of the settings pages we basically eliminated the accordion element and introduced sections with like sticky sections. So like the title of each section would be sticky as long as the section is visible. And we also introduced like a sticky footer so that the Save Changes button, for example, on some settings pages is always visible. So the user doesn't have to scroll all the way down to do or to save changes. We couldn't introduce that to all settings pages, so we only introduced this setting or this style to settings pages where we were able to remove the accordions, because we have a lot of settings pages in on the project level and on the group level, which have like a ton of different forms, and each form can have a save changes button, right? So we have some auto save settings, and then we have some which requires a save button. So this itself might be one thing to look at, how we can solve that little mess in settings as a whole. But yeah, this was the first edition. I think it's best shown here on the settings preferences page. And then the other big part was that let me go here. So for all the pages which still use this accordion style, we changed like the description of each section to use GL text secondary. So just to be more like consistent across the board, because there was a mix of secondary color and not. This was a subtle change, but was changed through all the settings pages we have in GitLab. And then the bigger change was to introduce, maybe it's best shown here in the repo settings, to unify like the appearance of managing content within settings, right? To use like this new GL card style, just to unify the experience of how we show items in settings, and also to, this is not a good example. Maybe this is a better example, yeah. So to have like the add form. So before we had like settings where we intermixed actual settings like toggles, input fields with like an add form. And there was no break between, okay, what is actually, which are settings and which is like the add form itself. So with the introduction of this GL card, name to be defined in the future of this component, as we discussed yesterday, but that we have like a single approach how we display those additional content in settings and how it behaves with adding content and managing content. I think deploy tokens has another one, and deploy keys has also one. So it should be now pretty consistent across the board.
Yeah, and Sascha, to jump in here, the reason, if I remember right, that you did this was that under the previous state, you would have to actually navigate through the form first before you even saw what you had created for settings. So this kind of flips the paradigm where you see what you've already set, and then you can take an action to see the form and be able to do additional information. So this reduced the time it took to
Yes.
see what your settings were, and it made the action more meaningful, I think, right?
Yes. So that is 100% correct. So first, like a good example was webhooks, because it has a pretty long add form. So if you have like a smaller screen, this is a pretty big one here, but if you have a smaller one, you would never see content at its first glance. You would always be welcomed by the add form. So if you go to settings to manage content, you will never see that content, right? Because you would always be greeted by the form. Secondary, also, like if you rely on keyboard, like for accessibility reasons, for example, you would have to go through the whole form before you actually access the content which is there. And with the introduction of that component, we actually see at the first glance the content, and users don't have to go through the whole content, like the whole add form, before they see the content itself. And the third reason was that, as I mentioned, like managing those parts in settings, we had a lot of different paradigms, how we actually display them and how to add content and how to remove content and stuff like that. So we try to uniform the approach used across like settings UI with like this to be defined currently GL card custom implementation we have. So yeah, that were basically like the bigger changes we did across the board in settings UI.
I got just a question, like the ability to add new before seeing what exists just in the keyboarding and focus order. I was curious, like if there was exploration on, like you get to the bottom of the list and then you can add a new one to know that it's going to be appended to that, or like was there any exploration on some of that interaction?
Not really. We like we were pretty time limited, so we just scanned the product of and also like like the design system of what components do we have available today and which would be the best to use for our use case. And this was basically what we came up with. So there was no research involved in this decision making.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, I think this sums up like the most important changes. There were a ton of small changes, but I don't think you like in the summary they filled up maybe a milestone, but I think like these are the bigger changes we did. Oh, I forgot one change. Let me see where we actually can see it. So we did another change where we actually started to limit certain field lengths, like the width of input fields, for example, because in a lot of different areas in settings, we basically just use like 100% width for input fields or drop downs or whatever all the time, even if the actual required input might only be one char or two chars. So we actually tried to make use of what actually is defined in pajamas, right? To have like the different sizes for input fields, like the small, medium, large Excel sizes. So I don't have in mind where we actually did that, but it were like different parts of settings where we came across, we tried to implement that paradigm as well, or to make use of that. Maybe that helps as well.
Yeah, yeah. So you showed examples from both user settings and project. Like what was your approach to unifying like across like the different levels of settings or different types of settings we have?
Like I said, we didn't do any, or we tried to avoid any high level changes. So we did not touch like those overview page, like those settings pages, like to change like the accordions on those pages, because in itself, these settings pages are very long, and they would need a more holistic approach, maybe to tackle or like to change. The reason why we actually introduced like the sticky headers here, for example. These were pages which used the side-by-side layout, which had like the section title on the left and then the content on the right. And we tried to simplify those pages because we were in alignment that, especially with the introduction of the cyber navigation, it doesn't make sense to use that layout. So we wanted to get rid of the 2-column layout in settings, and we replaced those instances with, like the sticky sections instead. So that was one of the more conceptual changes we did, but we didn't want to go further and, like touch those, settings and group pages as a whole, but only made changes to the sections itself and not to the pages. Does that answer your question at all?
It does, yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot, and I know that we've covered a lot of this too, but just for the posterity in the recording and having it down, I thought it would be helpful. You did mention when we talked before that there were just some things that you and Annabel ran into that would be just good, like helpful to know. I'm curious what some of those things might have been.
Yeah. So when we did some research on, we searched a bit through Reddit and social media channels and stuff like that, just to get an idea of feedback around settings UI, and also like searching, like in issues, like older issues. And one of the things which came up quite often, or like multiple times, was that it's very hard to search through settings, because if you're in general, you only search through the general settings and not integration, webhooks, or whatever. But maybe you don't know that a setting, like is part of general, or like another, like another section here. So it would be beneficial to have like a global search. Example, if you're in a project, that you can search through all the project settings. That was one of the things we saw, but that was like out of scope because it would be a big change and needs more, like, yeah, I think like a holistic look at things, because currently how settings is built, it's not possible to introduce that, right? So that was one of the things, because there are some overlapping things like, like in merge requests or general, and which you might not know where settings are located, right? So it's hard to find those. So that's maybe something, to note down or have a look at, the discoverability of settings.
Yeah. I have a few more questions, but Dan or Chris wanted to give you time to ask anything that might be on your mind.
Nothing major. Thanks for walking through them, through the changes. I noticed in advanced looked quite different as well on this one. Could you maybe talk through some of the changes that happen there? Because they look like they use the things that look like the cards where you add stuff, but there's no add-in stuff in there.
So you mean integrations, for example?
Oh no, in general, advanced.
Sorry. Oh, yeah.
And there was a big red thing that used to be at the bottom as well.
Yeah, I think Austin is not here, right? He would maybe be interested in that. So there's a long story around that advanced section in settings and how we, could improve or remove like the alert style, like the custom alert style, which wasn't an alert and stuff like that. So that was one of the last things we tried to see if we could use the cards here, just because we use that component quite often in settings, so it was on hand to make use of it here as well. Not that it has to be like that, but I know that the advanced section popped up quite often, that it needs some change. So that was like just our approach to try to clean up some things, because there were a lot of different elements used in this section, and now we just use like a single one for everything. Not saying that this is the best approach, but it was just, on hand to make a change here as well, to clean up things.
I notice on advanced here, like some of the card headings have the description in them, and some have the what seems to be a description in the body. Like, was that intentional?
That was just kept as it was. So before we had like some elements which had like a description and some did not have one, so we just kept it as is. So that was basically like a one-to-one translation from what we had before, to using cards. So no, I mean this could be changed easily, but we didn't want to go any further down the rabbit hole in the advanced section than just doing the minimum.
Okay.
Maybe we can quickly. Well, we were now in project, and this is the groups section, but let me, where we have it, advanced project settings here. So just to show you maybe like how it looked before. So this was what we had before, right? So we had like this custom element here, then some other, so delete this project had like this other custom styling, which looks a bit like an alert, but it isn't, and stuff like that. So we just tried to clean this a bit up, and because we use the like this new implementation of card quite often in settings, it just made sense to clean these sections up with that component as well.
What was the hardest thing about working in settings?
It's the hardest thing is that once you start changing things, you will discover more and more and more. So like when we first scheduled like the first milestone, or like the milestone we wanted to work on settings UI, we just started at one in, I think, in project settings, and then we discovered so many things we could change or align, stuff which weren't correct, stuff we could migrate, like components which don't use, or like loose components, bootstrap styles. They were just like, I think it's just like overall a bit a mess, because like like I think like all, or like almost all groups touch settings at some point. It's just like Wild West in settings currently. And then when we started like cleaning up things, we just saw that we need to add another milestone, because after the first milestone, we did clean up some things, but we couldn't reach an end. So the state after the first milestone was basically an even bigger mess than when we started, because we introduced new things and we tried to clean up, but we couldn't, like do everything in one milestone. So that's why we added another one to at least, clean the stuff up we already started working on, so we could at least like finish off some of the work. And then we actually discussed if we want to add a third milestone to it, and and then basically we knew that foundations would have a more holistic view on settings itself, so it wasn't worth like adding another milestone to it. And here we are now, right? 16.4. So because the problem I see is that, like for example, like fields, there are like a lot of fields which do not use like components from GitLab UI, for example. Or there are a lot of custom implementations in settings and stuff like that. So yeah, I think one thing would be to migrate and clean up things, and then we also have like this different approaches, like settings pages like this, which have like the accordion feature, and then we have other settings pages which had like the side-by-side view, which we eliminated by now. And there were some other custom implementations as well, in different areas. So
I know we're at time, but I'm curious, since you mentioned that multiple groups, pretty much every group has settings related to it. What was your approval process when you made changes specific to a group?
We like in the beginning, the first changes we did was just clean up. So there were not a lot of approvals needed. When we dig further into changing like the situation of having like those ad forms and content lists within settings, it was not all the time clear who is responsible for those settings. So some of the things, we have like a lot of groups which don't have like any assigned designers at the moment as well. So these for those things we just went ahead, and for others we actually pinged designers to be aware of changes, or that we made changes, especially like in merge requests and other areas where we knew that people are also working on overhauling some settings. So but we can do better, I think. That was one of our in our retro in the retrospective. I think it's always a bit of trade-off, because we don't want to ping too many people on our changes, because I think it can get quite busy when we work in a special on a theme. But I know on the other hand, we also want to raise awareness, right? That we do changes in other people's ballpark. So yeah, we're still trying to find ways how we can improve that as a whole, not related to settings, but as general for PaperCut work. So yeah, maybe that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I guess if you have a second, I have just maybe one more question, and maybe two if we have time. But are you good with that?
Sure.
All right. I was curious. Did you involve tech writing at all, or did you make any copy changes or content changes?
Yeah, we did. So we did some minor changes whenever there were like content changes involved. We pinged tech writing as well. We didn't do too much, to be honest. I think we removed some more or less duplications of help texts throughout like settings UI, because sometimes you have like a help text right in the description or like in the summary, and then you would have like another help text right below that when you expand the section, and it would be more or less the same. So we pinged tech writing on some of those changes, or if we wanted to merge multiple texts into a single one. So yes, tech writing was also involved in some cases.
Awesome. Cool. Maybe there's something we can add async. I think it's probably a deeper question, but I'd love to know more about like what, other than the card component, what components were helpful or not helpful, or, and things you ran into. But I know we're doing some work on the cards separately that we've discussed, so I'd be interested to know more about that. But maybe we can take that one async. Does anybody else have any questions before we close out? Oh, Dan,
This
you
was
mentioned
scheduled for longer, so don't panic too much.
Oh, good. All right. Zoom is showing my count up, but no count down. I guess I should try to change that. There we go. Time remaining. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I would love to know more about, in that case, thanks, Dan. I would love to know more about, like, in addition to like card, what other components were critical in the effort.
Yeah, like as I mentioned, like there are a lot of like things which are not tied to components in settings UI. So those were things we tried to eliminate, or like stuff we tried to migrate towards like GitLab UI components, which were not used yet. But I think there are like there's a wizard somewhere in settings as well. Don't remember where it was, but yeah, and just like overall, like the paradigm of like the different settings sections behave differently. Like I mentioned before, like some of them have like a save button, some of them are like automatically saved, and these implementations of those forms are all a bit different. So yeah, like I think the devil is like in those details. So in terms of components we used, I think like the most used component update was like using this GL card or updating whatever has been used to that instance of GL card, or like updating like different input fields or like form fields towards like like the GitLab UI counterparts. I wouldn't call that a component, but yeah, as I mentioned, like the other thing we introduced was the sticky header, sticky footer paradigm, which is currently solely living in the product, because it's scoped to settings, like a lot of the other components which are used in settings, right? This collapse expand component is also like one I have only seen in settings UI. So yeah, I think it's very beneficial of Foundations having a look and what we could try to improve and streamline and which components can be used throughout like the whole settings UI.
That's a really interesting topic, just about form submission and the way forms are working, and like autosave versus manual save. That's gonna be something, Chris, that we'll have to think about with backend as well, that we hasn't been on my radar, but that's really good to think through.
Yeah, like the way it's built, or why some settings have like, like the autosave settings are usually migrated ones which use Vue. And then the other ones with the save buttons are still like HAML with, like JavaScript with like jQuery or whatever has been used. And each section sometimes have like a different backend call. So I was told, we have like a form per section because there are like different backend calls. So yeah, this is maybe something to keep in mind. And then we have some settings where like only if you do changes, the save button would show up. We have other instances where it's shown all the time. Then we have instances where the button is disabled until you do a change, and then it gets active. Yeah, so there are a ton of implementations for those forms within settings. So
yeah, it seems like we may need to do some kind, but it feels like a first step needs to be some kind of audit where we can at least unfortunately review every single setting to see, okay, using the UI kit or not, and then some of these other attributes of, okay, what is the sort of saving pattern? What are some of the other attributes that might be useful for us? Because yeah, I think scope is going to be a big question. Are we really committing ourselves with the team to sort of refactoring every single settings? I said that loud. I'm like, of course we're not doing that. No team would ever commit to that. So then what's the way forward there?
A good question, because we also don't want to like paint ourselves into any kind of corner with like, oh, this is how forms should behave, and then we run into some back end process that it's like we can't change that. And so
yeah,
that'll be interesting.
Maybe one more things, like in our component library, for form fields, we have like the prefix and suffix, right? For like, at least for input fields. So this could also be beneficial if that would be used in settings UI for at least, because we have a lot of instances where we actually look for a certain input. Let's say you have to input like something in bytes or megabytes, or I don't know, like what unit is being expected. And currently we either put that in brackets behind like the field label, or it's written in the description, in the form description. So could be an opportunity to use like the suffix, for example, for that. So not only if, I don't know, like if you can only input like 2 digits, we can shrink the form field to like a reasonable width, and then maybe we could also use like the suffix for that. I think I actually created like a year ago or even longer than that, like an issue for that. But maybe, this is just a brain dump now because we didn't have the time to do that. I'm even not sure if the suffix is already available in GitLab UI or not for form input fields.
I believe that it is, but I don't think it's widely used.
Let me see if I can find the issue.
Actually, if I'm looking at it in GitLab UI and it does not come anywhere close to design specs. So I'm assuming that anything similar in the product is not using a component.
My suspicion is that most of our system work on it will be in patterns and how decisions are made for settings. Like from what Sascha was saying, it sounds like things are in a place where things are consistent within themselves, but not consistent when you take 3 setting screens and stick them next to each other. There might be 3 completely different things, but on if you just look at one page at a time within itself, it's all there. And I suspect some of that is from not having a one place to look for. If I'm trying to get this type of thing, how should it be? And it's just matching within its pages. So yeah, I suspect that'll be a large part of our system output.
So, well, we are at time, so I will put this on unfiltered and we'll have a record of it. And if we need to schedule a follow-up with more questions once we have time to think through this, I think that would be good too. But thank you to you and Annabel for all everything you've done so far and for filling us in. Like, very helpful.
Yeah, I hope we, we did some improvements and not like vice versa. But at least I think some of the cleanup was necessary. Yeah, looking forward to the foundation work on settings as well.
Yeah.